Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us to learn more about COVID-19 vaccines. I am Nicole Haar, and I will be your host throughout the webinar. We will get started with the presentation in just a moment, but first, I have a few announcements. All viewers, we are recording this webinar and will archive the recording on our website within the next few days. If you have questions during the presentation, please type your questions into the question box located in your control panel on the right side of your screen. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session immediately following the presentation. If you have specific medical questions, we ask that you please follow up with your healthcare team. Please note that the PKD Foundation does not offer medical advice, and the information shared during this webinar is not intended to be a substitute for consultations with your healthcare professionals. Care and treatment decisions related to your health must be made in consultation with your healthcare team. I am delighted to introduce you to our speakers, Dr. Naeem Issa and Dr. Patrick Dean. Dr. Issa is currently a transplant nephrologist and consultant at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He had his training in internal medicine and nephrology at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio and his transplant nephrology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. His main interests are kidney and pancreas transplantation, living kidney donation, and kidney paired exchange. Dr. Dean is the surgical director of the Kidney Pancreas Transplant Program and a consultant and associate professor of surgery in the Division of Transplantation Surgery at Mayo Clinic, Rochester. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and subsequently graduated from the University of Alabama School of Medicine in Birmingham. He completed his general surgery residency and fellowship in abdominal transplantation surgery at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He was appointed to the faculty at Mayo in 2006. In addition to his clinical duties, Dr. Dean is the program director of the Abdominal Transplantation Surgery Fellowship Program and co-chair of the Enterprise Transplant Informatics Workgroup. Dr. Dean's clinical and research interests include kidney and pancreas transplantation, preemptive kidney transplantation, living donor kidney transplantation, transplantation for polycystic kidney disease, and antibody-mediated kidney graft injury. Welcome, Dr. Issa and Dr. Dean. And Dr. Issa, we will turn the presentation over to you so that you can share your slides.
Okay. See my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and thank you for the introduction. Let me introduce myself. I'm a transplant nephrologist here at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I'll be joined today by Dr. Patrick Dean. He's a transplant surgeon and the surgical director of the kidney transplant program here at Mayo. We'll try over the next 30 to 40 minutes to walk you through the main questions that you may have and the concerns you may have regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. We will tackle the main questions that come to mind. I'll try to provide you with some of the evidence behind how those vaccines were developed and whether they are safe to be used. Whether you are a polycystic kidney disease patient with normal kidney function or with declining kidney function or chronic kidney disease, whether you're on dialysis, whether you're a transplant patient, we'll try to answer all those questions and concerns. So we'll dedicate the first, as I said, 30 to 40 minutes to a presentation. It will be a kind of formal presentation, and we'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for open questions. Okay, to set up the stage, I want to address a few things and why we're talking about COVID-19 vaccination and prevention. Because, we know that people with chronic kidney disease, those who are on dialysis, patients with kidney transplant, and other chronic medical problems can have weaker immune systems, making them really hard to fight any infection. More often, patients with those conditions, they have other conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and others that makes them also more prone for more severe illness if they attracted COVID-19. So what could be the potential serious illnesses that people with chronic kidney disease infected with COVID-19 at risk for? They're at risk for having an acute kidney injury. We know actually now we have ample data on patients who get hospitalized with COVID-19. They have a higher risk of developing acute kidney injury that can lead actually to very serious consequences, can lead to needing dialysis, and ultimately can complicate things and lead unfortunately to death. And patients with chronic kidney disease, they don't have much of kidney reserve. Any infection, especially overwhelming infection like COVID-19, can be very serious in some patients, and their kidney function can be easily tipped over to require dialysis. And how COVID-19 can cause kidney injury, the toxic shock that it will cause, this microinflammation. You probably heard about the cytokine release storm that happens with severe COVID-19 infection, can actually tip the kidney function over, the blood clotting that happens. And there is actually a lot of evidence now about direct infection with COVID-19 in the kidneys. There are a series of studies showing in postmortem patients, they isolated the COVID-19 virus in the kidneys themselves. And unfortunately, some of the patients who recover, and a lot of patients recover from the acute disease, the acute infection from COVID-19, they actually have serious consequences. They continue to have low kidney function. Some of them actually, they got dismissed from the hospital on dialysis and so forth. Now, our transplant patients are at higher risk for COVID-19. We are accumulating data, but we know some transplant patients from our own experience and other centers' experience, some transplant patients may actually, despite immunosuppression, have a weak immune system. They may have, very mild disease, but some of them actually may become very sick and they may have greater severity of disease than normal subjects. And one big example, actually, the New York City experience during last summer, that experience revealed very high rates of respiratory failure and mortality in transplant recipients, whether kidney or other organs. So what we will be discussing today, we'll go over an overview of the approved vaccines, their safety and efficacy. We will discuss the importance of the vaccine at different stages of polycystic kidney disease. We will also share with you what we know about safety and efficacy of the vaccine in transplant recipients, and what we know about getting back to normal after the vaccine. And it's a hot topic. Today there was actually, as you probably all heard, there's some CDC recommendation easing up some of the outdoor masking, and so we'll go over those. So currently in the US, we have 3 COVID-19 vaccines that are currently authorized. They received an emergency authorization by the FDA. And there are a lot of vaccines that are in the pipelines, actually, and currently in large-scale clinical trials, whether in the US or abroad. But mainly we'll talk about the 3 vaccines that are approved to be used. That's the traditional phases of vaccine development and clinical trials. Actually take decades, it takes several years. It starts with phase 1 and some healthy volunteers, then go to phase 2 trial with several hundreds of volunteers and so forth, to the phase 3 trial, where actually it's a larger scale, until actually it gets to being approved and being used, and after it's actually start to be used at larger scale, we call it the phase 4, the phase 4 of the development of any vaccine, where actually researchers continue to collect data on their long term side effects and the benefits. But the timeline for COVID-19 was sped up. You all know about that. Below you see the traditional timeline. It takes a lot of time. Actually, what happened in the COVID-19 vaccine, a lot of effort was put in developing that vaccine, and the manufacturing and development actually started when it was being tested in clinical trials. That's why now you see it available, and actually we may have surplus of the vaccine in this country and around the world. What I can tell you, there was not actually how it was done. It was done through rigorous scientific trial. Yes, it was sped up, but never cut corners on safety. I can reassure you about that. And here is why. Because we already have a lot of information about other coronaviruses. So we did not really start from scratch. Yes, the mRNA vaccines are new. First time are in clinical use, yes. But the technology actually is not. It dates to 20 years and more, actually. And there were some trials before on mRNA vaccines in influenza and Zika virus and so forth. Also, during this pandemic, a lot of people participated in those clinical trials. So we did not spend a lot of time to find volunteers, which was great. And of course, the money factor always play a role. The U.S. government and other agencies and governments around the world invested a lot of money, billions of dollars, to support the work of those companies to develop the vaccine. It turns out as well that the mRNA vaccines are faster to produce, are easier than traditional vaccines. And as I said, the manufacturing happened at the same time as safety studies were done in the clinical trials. So the vaccines are now readily available, and they were distributed. They are actually largely distributed and open to everyone who wants a vaccine. This is the coronavirus that causes COVID-19. As you can see here, it has those spike protein. This is why it's called corona. From Latin, corona means crown, because those spikes protein confers that shape of like a crown. So those spike proteins are very important. This is how the virus clings to its target, to human cells, the lung cells, and this is how it starts to incorporate itself inside the cells by by binding and clinging to those receptors on our human cells. That's a nice representation, three-dimensional representation of the virus. So those spike protein are very important in how virulent and how aggressive this virus is. So how the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines work? It's actually simple, but it's a very high tech. It's a technology that has been, as I said, in development over the last 20, 30 years. The mRNA vaccines carry the genetic material of the virus, part of the mRNA of the virus. And once incorporated in our cells, it actually teaches our cells how to make a harmless piece of that spike protein. So our human cells will start to express those spike protein, and that actually trigger the immune system to start producing antibodies to protect us from getting infection if we attract that SARS-CoV-2 virus. They do not affect our DNA. So it's actually a myth that the mRNA will incorporate itself in our DNA and change it. It doesn't actually do that. The mRNA does not enter our cells nuclei at all. Once our body start to produce using that genetic material, the messenger RNA, and start to develop those spike proteins on the membrane of our cells, those copies of the mRNA are destroyed by our cells. So it does not cause any harm. And mRNA vaccines cannot give someone COVID-19. It's just part of the virus that codes for that spike protein. In simple words, COVID-19 mRNA vaccines teaches our cells how to make the virus spike protein to trigger an immune response and build immunity to the virus. Okay, it does not affect or interact with our DNA, and our cells, when they're done, they use that material, the genetic material from the virus, they break it down, and our body get rid of it as soon as it's finished from using its instruction. It's like infecting us with a chip that actually program our cells to make those spike protein, and our body immune system get triggered, make those antibodies, and protect us from future infection. So the first vaccine that was approved, probably you've heard about it, is the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. It's an mRNA vaccine. It requires 2 doses, about 3 weeks apart, 21 days apart. It has been shown in clinical trials to be 95% effective, and it's authorized in people who are 16 years and older. So it was studied in about 43,000 people in the US, Europe, Turkey, and other parts of the world. Half of the participants were women, half of them were men, so it's large scale. The second vaccine was the Moderna vaccine, received emergency use by the FDA as well. Shortly after the Pfizer one. It's also required 2 doses, but this one is 4 weeks apart. The other one was 3 weeks apart. It's also similar efficacy, about 95%, and was authorized in patients older than 18 years. Why is that? Because it was studied in people 18 years of age and older. It was only actually done in the US, and as you can see here, 47% were female and 53% were male. Now, the Johnson & Johnson, which is the third vaccine that was actually approved by the FDA, it's a different technology. It's the old technology and old way of doing vaccine. It's a viral vector vaccine, meaning the COVID-19 genetic material is actually placed in a different harmless virus. In this case, it's called adenovirus that can cause common cold and actually very frequent. That virus, as seen here, will enter the cells of our body and use the cell machinery to produce harmless pieces of the spike protein. So it's different technology, older technology, but also efficient. And we started, creating those viral vectors back at that days of the 1970s. So a lot of the vaccine that we use now actually use this technology of using a harmless virus. The good thing about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it uses a non-replicating adenovirus. So this virus does not really replicate once it enters our body. And it was evaluated also on about 43,000 people, 18 years and older, in the US, Brazil, South Africa, and so forth. So that's large scale and multinational. As I said, it's a non-replicating viral vector vaccine. It requires only 1 dose, which is a good thing. Has been shown to be actually about 72% effective in preventing moderate to severe COVID-19 disease. And typically, between 2 weeks to 4 weeks when we start to have the best protection after the vaccination. As you probably all know, on April 13, the CDC and the FDA recommended a pause of the use of the JJ COVID-19 vaccine because of reported rare and severe type of blood clotting and low platelets. Actually, if you look at the data, and looked at it actually this morning, the warning was about low platelets and severe clotting disorder in some women in the age of 30 to 39 years. So far, we have nearly 8 million doses given in this country and only 15 cases. So the risk is extremely, extremely low. It's about 11.8 per million doses. So it's extremely, extremely low risk. On April 23rd, last Friday, the CDC, after reviewing the safety data of the vaccine, they actually lifted the pause on the use of the JJ vaccine, or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And they said that the benefits of the vaccine outweigh really those very rare and exceptional risks. You know, if you look at how effective and how efficacious is the seasonal flu vaccine, we all take it every fall. At best, it confers you about 60% protection. There are years, for example, if you look between 2014 and 2015, the flu vaccine was only 19% efficient, or effective. So just to tell you, when we talk about 72% protection in the JJ vaccine, Johnson & Johnson, and 95% in both Moderna and Pfizer, you see how efficient are those vaccines and breakthrough in science and medicine. So in clinical trials, researchers measure how well a vaccine prevent illness in a controlled setting, right? It's a clinical trial. This is called efficacy. Some people actually do not really understand what's 95%. They think that you actually administer that vaccine to 100 people, and 95 out of those 100 people are completely protected from the viral illness, from COVID-19. Actually, it does mean that the vaccine reduces the amount of disease, of infection, by 95% for vaccinated people compared to people who did not get the vaccine. So it's a very important point to understand. Most common side effects from the COVID vaccine is actually good to have side effects. If you have a little bit of fever or chill, that means your immune system is reacting and reacting to the vaccine, and it's producing antibodies. Typically, the most likely side effects like fatigue, headache, pain at the site of the injection occurs within 1 to 2 days after vaccination, up to 1 week. They are more seen with the mRNA vaccine, Pfizer and the Moderna, after the second dose, because your immune system had seen the vaccine before, and more likely to be experienced in younger people rather than older people. And that's because younger people have stronger immune system. So now we'll discuss the importance of the vaccine at different stages of PKD. If you have PKD and your kidneys are functioning well, you're still at early stage, your creatinine is well preserved, and you are generally healthy, it is important to be vaccinated, and the answer is yes. It is recommended, like anyone else, it is recommended to get the vaccine. Should you get the vaccine if you have PKD and you are on dialysis, or you have advanced chronic kidney disease? Also, the answer is yes, it is highly recommended. Now, if you have PKD and you've been evaluated for kidney transplant, you're actually waitlisted for kidney transplant, or you're going to be evaluated for kidney transplant. And actually, I saw this morning in my clinic someone who asked me about that question: should I get vaccinated? The answer is yes. Actually, it's a recommendation from all societies to get the vaccine at that stage before the transplant. What about children and adolescents with PKD? As I said, the Pfizer vaccine was authorized in people who are older than 16 years. The Moderna and Johnson & Johnson vaccines are authorized for people older than 18 years. For now, there is no recommendations for younger children and adolescents, but it's been actually studied, and probably within the next few months we'll see some recommendation. It's probably will be extrapolated and extended to younger people, younger than the age of 16 years. Now, some facts about the COVID-19 vaccine. All the trials that were done, because they were done, as I said, we were in the middle of a pandemic. They recruited patients. There are not a lot of chronic kidney disease patients or any transplant patient that were actually recruited in those trials. We know in the Pfizer study had about 250 patients with chronic kidney disease. There was no breakout of safety data in that group. The Johns Hopkins group actually recorded or showed us their initially their experience by vaccinating several types of solid organ transplant recipients, 97 kidney transplant, 35 liver transplant recipients, and so forth. And they actually did not show that the vaccine had higher or different symptoms or different unwanted symptoms than the general population. And there was, very importantly, because when you give a vaccine, you may entice the immune system to be stronger. So from what we know, that the vaccine given after transplant does not increase the risk of rejection. What does the American Society of Transplantations recommend? They recommend that transplant candidates should be targeted for vaccination while they are waiting a transplant. So at the phase of being listed or being evaluated, that's the best time to get vaccinated. Now, if given prior to transplant, ideally both doses should be completed. But now, if you get called for a kidney offer, I would just go and do it, and then your team will decide case by case when to give you the second dose. And that happened recently to one of our recipients that had the first dose and got kidney transplant and did very well, got the vaccine after a few weeks after the transplant. And in general, vaccines are recommended about 2 weeks after the transplant, or about, depending on the vaccine, 3 to 6 months down the road. And the reason is initially, when you get the kidney transplant, you get overwhelmed, your immune system get, wiped out with immunosuppression to accept the new organ. So you may not develop any antibodies at that stage. So your team will decide when it's best to give you the vaccine. So what do we know about safety and efficacy of the vaccine for transplant recipients, kidney transplant recipients? And are all the 3 vaccines safe for transplant recipients? Yes, they are, because none of them use a live virus. The mRNA-based vaccine, they use the genetic material that J&J does not use, the Johnson & Johnson does not use a live vaccine. It's actually the adenovirus, a live virus. It's an attenuated, non-replicating virus, so it's not really a live virus and does not cause any illness. Now, I invite you actually to frequently look at the American Society of Transplantation website. They have frequently asked question sheets that they update. They update that every couple of months. And what do we know now about the efficacy of COVID vaccine and transplant recipient? We don't know a lot. It's the unknown. We still recommend that all transplant candidates, and now that the vaccine is open to everyone and their household, to receive the vaccine. If someone is transplanted after receipt of only 1 dose of the vaccine, the optimal timing, as I said, is not for the second dose is not defined. Typically, we wait about 4 weeks to give the second dose. And as I said, your team will decide when to give you the second dose. What did we learn so far? The data is actually, the data are very scarce, but they're coming. The Johns Hopkins group just published in JAMA about a month ago their experience in 436 transplant recipients. Among them were 219, so 50% of those were kidney transplant recipients. So they vaccinated them. They studied the response after 1 dose, single dose of the mRNA vaccine. The median age, as I said, 56 years. About 61% were women, 89% were white among that cohort of people who received or recipients, kidney and other organ recipients. 52% received the Pfizer vaccine and 48% received the Moderna vaccine. And they actually tested them with the spike protein antibodies 14 to 21 days after vaccination. Unfortunately, the data are not very encouraging, because after the first dose, only 17% of transplant recipient produced antibodies at median of about 20 days, I said, after the first dose. When they look at their data, they showed that those who are taking CellCept, mycophenolate mofetil, or Myfortic, that's an antimetabolite that we use typically in transplant patients, those who are on those medications had less response and developed produced antibodies at the less frequency. Now, a couple of weeks ago, a patient asked me if he read that that paper, and he asked me if he should stop the CellCept for a few days before the vaccine and after the vaccine. I advise him not to do that. So in order to respond, just take your medication and do the vaccine. Also, they showed that older recipients were less likely to develop antibodies. We know that older recipient on immunosuppression, their immune system is less active. And there are some critique about this study, and I'm sure they will soon publish their findings after the second dose. Actually, I heard it's going to come up soon on the publication. We don't have really a lot of data of the 2-dose vaccine. Recently, actually, I'm not showing it here. A new paper is published from France and Kidney International about 300 kidney transplant recipients. And the response after the 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine was actually not encouraging, was about 5% response. So, are there other things that transplant recipients need to consider about the vaccine? Of course, you ask your provider. As transplant specialists, we recommend, and we still feel that it is reasonable to anticipate that the vaccine will offer some benefit. There are actually, I stumbled upon a lot of publications now talking about potentially doubling the dose for transplant recipients, as we do sometimes certain vaccine for dialysis patients. Sometimes those who don't respond to the hepatitis B vaccine, we double the dose, or give a third dose, maybe a booster instead of 2 doses. Those are still in trials, but are actually being considered. I still feel, and we still recommend, to get the vaccine for transplant patients. Don't get discouraged by those data. There could be, some response that happen later, and we know that in transplant patients being on immunosuppressive, their immune system can delay in producing antibodies. If you live in an endemic area that have a lot of infections still at high levels, I still recommend to get the vaccine. So that's the big question now. What do we know about getting back to normal after the vaccine? It's hard, what we know and what we are still learning. We know that the COVID-19 vaccines are effective. They're effective at preventing COVID-19 disease, especially severe illness and death. That's had been proven, and there are a lot of publications coming up in real world and from different countries around the world that those vaccines are effective in preventing, the most severe illnesses related to COVID-19. And I feel still we should have prevention steps to keep stopping the spread of the virus. I think they're still important as more and more people are getting vaccinated. And as you know, there are a lot of people who are hesitant in getting the vaccine. So until we reach, a good amount of people who are vaccinated, I think we should keep doing what we're doing. So we're still learning. I think we still need to learn more about the protection that COVID-19 vaccine provide under life conditions. So far, as I said, we have good amount of data showing they're effective, especially now that there are some variants of the virus that are arising in different parts of the world, and even here in the US. The early data shows that those vaccines are efficacious against some variants. We don't know about, the evolving variants that are, coming up, in different parts of the world, and some of them are already here in the US. We're still learning how well those vaccines keep people from spreading the disease. There is some data saying they decrease the spread of the disease, but we're still learning about that. And how long they protect people. It's probably going to be something that we have to take every year, like the flu vaccine. That's what most researchers are thinking at this stage. Now, do I need to wear a mask and avoid close contacts with others if I have been vaccinated? I think the answer is still a yes as of today, especially for transplant recipients. Now, if your household, everyone is vaccinated, you are vaccinated, you're on dialysis or have CKD, and we think you're well protected, perhaps at your household or outside the house, if you're walking or not in areas that are crowded, you can actually loosen up masking and such. But if you live in an area that has high infection rate, I would still recommend to not to let your safeguards by wearing a mask, hand washing, and so forth. Avoiding poorly ventilated spaces like eating out in restaurants or going to the gym, and especially if you're a kidney transplant recipient or someone who has very low immune system. As you know, today the CDC is the outdoors masking advice for vaccinated people, and we still those are going to be updated every few weeks, I think. Having said that, I think we'll open the floor for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much. That was very informative, and I think you've actually already addressed quite a few of the questions that we have received so far, but we did get some questions ahead of the broadcast, so I'll start with those. And if you are out there and you have questions that we haven't addressed, please go ahead and type them in and we'll get to those in a minute. So as you mentioned, the PKD community, I think, is very familiar with the Johns Hopkins research that came out. And I think we have several questions about what does this mean for me personally, particularly if you maybe are not participating in the research study. Should you be getting antibody testing done?
Yeah, actually I had this question yesterday in the clinic, someone who got it, and now it's widespread across all labs that they can test for the spike protein. If you asked me a month ago, this test was not available in clinical practice, but now it's available. You can get tested. You can ask your. We don't really recommend, to test everyone to see if they really responded by producing anti-spike protein. What I recommend to any transplant patients, yes, the data are somehow discouraging. As I said, there is another paper from France where the rate of response was only 5% and among 300 to 400 kidney transplant recipients. We expect that the transplant recipient would not respond. I expect to be more than 5%, but that's we'll learn more and more. So in the meanwhile, I would recommend to continue not to let your safeguards and keep, avoiding crowds, avoiding, especially if you live in an endemic area that has very high infectious rate. I think you should keep masking and wearing a mask and, all the recommendation, that's what I would recommend.
Dr. Dean, did you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the reason to do any test really is it going to change the way you behave or the way you act? And I don't think that even having a positive test would make me want to change the way I'm behaving. So, but there are some people I think that'll gain some comfort from it, but I don't think it's not absolute. And I don't know that it's probably not very cheap either. if I were a lab company making tests, I would probably sell it right now for quite a bit. But yeah, I personally haven't had it done, even though I could. Nobody in my family has. I don't see it might give people a false sense of security, perhaps, too, because you can still become infected after vaccination, whether or not, and those patients haven't been, those breakthrough cases haven't been, they've been characterized fairly well, but I don't think that the results have been published yet about antibody levels or that sort of thing, too. So, and you can make antibodies also that aren't against a certain protein, but they may not be lethal to the virus also. They may not neutralize the virus is the other thing too. So I don't recommend that test currently.
All very good points. We did have a specific question about antibody tests on the market, like buying, I think this means buying something that you can do at home or going to a lab. I don't know if you want to comment on what might be available out there.
Yeah, I don't know enough about them, but to know what is all available, partly because I don't think they're that necessary, so I haven't looked into it. But so I can't comment necessarily on the quality of those tests or the reproducibility. It's sort of like a lot of the screening for SARS-CoV-2 in general. The quicker and easier it is to do, generally it's not as good of a test, or not as sensitive a test. But
okay. Very good points. So we had a couple of specific questions. I want to generalize them a little bit so they apply to everyone. We get a question about having allergies and getting the COVID vaccine. This specific was asking about nuts, but if you have allergies such as nuts or dairy or any allergies, are you at higher risk getting the vaccine and having a reaction?
Okay. Yeah, I don't think, if you have severe allergies to certain drugs and broad spectrum allergies, we recommend not to take the vaccine. But if you have some food allergies, I don't think it's a contraindication to, like specifically a peanut allergy. We don't think it's prohibitive from getting the vaccine. There are people who have who develop anaphylactic shock to certain medications and have broad spectrum anaphylactic shock or anaphylaxis and reaction and allergies to many things. Those are the people who are discouraged from taking the vaccine. But the simple food allergies or isolated food allergies should not disqualify someone from taking the vaccine.
What about other health concerns, such as seizures or something like that? Does that put you at more risk of getting the vaccine?
I don't think so. Actually, it's recommended for people who have chronic conditions to be vaccinated, because those people who have not necessarily seizures, but have other chronic conditions are the ones who actually have the worst outcomes when they get infected. So to be protected, we recommend the vaccine for people who have chronic conditions, chronic medical condition, whatever they are.
Okay. Any additional comments on those questions? Okay. Nope. So you mentioned, I think, booster shots. Do you anticipate that particularly transplanted patients may need a booster shot at some point?
Well, I think I am aware of a couple of studies actually in Europe. I have some colleagues in France and Switzerland. I was talking to them the other day, and they're studying giving actually a third dose. Here in the US, it has to be done in clinical trials, so it's hard, but it's being studied somewhere else, and I think we learn from those. Yeah, I mean, could be in the audience someone who had previously had issues with getting mounting immune response to the hepatitis B vaccine, and that's very common in dialysis population, CKD population, where you give the booster for the hepatitis B on several occasions, and you don't get any antibodies. So there were studies that were done in that regard, and the hepatitis B non-responders, showing if you give more boosters or you give actually double the dose. And I'm sure as time goes, those will be studied. And there will be more recommendations for transplant patients with weaker immune system, perhaps to get, a bigger dose of give them a larger dose of the vaccine, or frequent boosters. But I cannot recommend any of that at this stage because it's not FDA approved. It's not really studied. Nothing is published in that regard. But I'm sure we're gonna get to that, or at least there will be trials about those.
Okay, very good. So I think this is a really good question. We've talked a lot about antibodies in transplant patients. What about memory cells and T cells? What can you tell us about that and their role?
Yeah, well, the role is very important. This is why people, in the Johns Hopkins study, people who were on CellCept, those are medication, we call them the antimetabolite, that inhibits the mitosis of lymphocytes like T cells or B cells. This is how they have their immunosuppressive properties. And I think people have actually problem with their T cells, whether taking immunosuppressive or have some immune deficiencies. Yes, they will have less memory response. They will have less response to the vaccine itself. Yes.
So we have quite a few questions about things that people want to get back to doing, after they've been vaccinated. Here's one. What about unvaccinated grandchildren? Should they quarantine for 2 weeks before you're around unvaccinated children? I'm sure this is from a grandparent who's really wanting to be around their grandchildren.
I think that for those sorts of things, it's a bit, if we're talking about certainly patients after a transplant, but even before, if you're on dialysis or have, in CKD 4 or 5, I think that you can't be totally protected all the time. And, it's important to see grandchildren. If they've been sick, or if a kid in their daycare has had it, it's different, I think, than if they're just grandkids that, are doing their thing and you want to see them. So and maybe I'm a little bit, not trying not to be too cavalier about it, but it's important for people's mental health to see their grandchildren. It's important for the grandchildren. So I think it'd be, unless they've been around, and for transplant patients, I think it's not just COVID. It's things, if they're just sick from daycare or from school or whatever, should probably not hang out with them for a while until they're feeling better. But I don't think you can get too strict about it and most families know generally what the other members are doing, and you wouldn't invite grandma over if the kid had just been sick or their best friend on their hockey team had been sick.
Very good. Grocery stores. Can we go to the grocery store? Yes. Double mask, be careful, keep your distance. Yeah. Do you feel like that's safe?
Actually, believe it or not, grocery stores are not that, they're not places at high risk for infection. There are a lot of studies, the most places are those enclosed places, like, bars, where people, get drunk after you drink alcohol, those droplets travel so far, people are loud, there is loud music, I would say grocery stores are one of the least places, to avoid. I think grocery store, in and out, you can get your stuff and keep social distancing. It's fine, just wearing one mask is okay. Avoiding eating out in restaurants, I think, if possible, unless you take also the precautions. People, eat and they tend to talk loudly, especially if there is live music or loud music. So yeah, grocery stores are okay.
Airplanes. We all want to go someplace.
Well, airplanes, actually, believe it or not, are safer than other places because they keep filtering the air, and the air is different. So I think airplanes, of course, you have to be cautious, and but I think they're less of an issue than other places like bars and gyms and bowling alleys, and
Okay.
The other thing about airplanes is everybody else is going to be wearing a mask.
Yeah. enforced.
because you have to get on a plane. I've traveled a few times and they're pretty serious about it. So whereas at a restaurant, obviously when you're eating, the masks aren't on, and other people just may not care to wear a mask, and I doubt you're going to get kicked out of an airplane, or out of a restaurant, but you won't get on a plane without a mask.
Right.
Very good point. So we'll switch gears a little bit here. Any consideration for, if transplanted patients in particular, I believe that's where this question is going, have received one vaccine and not getting antibodies from that, what about trying a different vaccine?
We don't have any data now, and it's not recommended, to tell you the truth. I would not recommend that.
Yeah, I think
No.
the mechanisms by which people would develop antibodies against this protein, the protein's made either way, and the reason it's not so much the vaccine delivery agent, it's more the body's response to the protein. So in theory, a different vaccine shouldn't make a lot of difference.
Okay, here's a good one. Is there any data showing efficacy for patients who have already tested positive for COVID-19 antibodies without vaccination, and guidance on getting the vaccine in the early stages of PKD?
We know that the antibodies that are acquired after being infected, they're short-lived. We don't know for how long the immunity lasts. So it's recommended actually to people who had previously had infection to be vaccinated, even if they have antibodies, because we don't know when those antibodies were off, and that maybe give them double protection as well if they have already the immunity from the infection and the immunity from the vaccine itself. So it's still highly recommended to get vaccinated.
Okay, so here's a question we've talked about, but we're going to flip it a little bit. We have a patient that is a transplanted patient and this person received Moderna and was tested for antibodies and tested positive. Should this person trust the test or be tested further? So test it again, I guess, for antibodies.
I would not retest. Actually, it's a good thing that they responded. As Dr. Dean mentioned earlier, that's not a guarantee that, they're protected 100% from acquiring the infection. As you know, when they say in trial 72% for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine of efficacy, 95% of efficacy for the other two, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, there's still that 5% or that other, 28% of not being protected. But what we know, they protect against severe disease. So some people may still get infected. It's like the flu when we have the flu season, and people would get the flu, but they don't get very sick. They don't get the flu-related pneumonia and go to the ICU or die from the flu. The same applies actually to COVID-19. So it's good that they have antibodies. I would not retest. But should not actually give you that false sense of I'm protected, I can do anything. I would still, as a transplant patient, I would still take precautions.
Yeah, that's actually my next question has to do with exactly what you're just saying. So we know that maybe transplanted patients in particular are not building a lot of antibodies. Any info on whether the risk of serious disease or hospitalization is lower? So I think I heard, yes.
Yeah, we still don't have information about it. Actually, there is I saw a publication this morning actually from the Mayo Clinic in Florida. They have a series of transplanted patients who got the vaccine and got sick after being vaccinated. A couple of them were sick. So what I would say, they don't protect 100%. A transplant patient is a very special patient, different than others. especially being on those immunosuppressive medication. We know that actually all transplant patients know that they are actually at higher risk for any infection, so I would still apply the same thing, and prevention is more important than anything, I think. So keep doing, taking precautions, I think, until that pandemic passes.
Okay. Here's a good question. If you experience side effects after the second dose, or the first, I guess, is that a good indication that you're building some immunity?
I think it's a good indication that your immune system is responding to it and producing antibodies. We see more side effects of those vaccines, and actually the second dose more so than the first dose in the mRNA vaccines like Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. And that because of the memory response, meaning, that second time that the patient is exposed to the vaccine. So there's about 5% chance of having actually some significant unwanted side effects after the second dose. I think it's a good thing. We see it more in younger people than older people, and that tells us, that their immune system is actually working. It's doing what it should do.
Good signs. That's good to know. What can you share about silent transmission of COVID from people that actually have been vaccinated?
Okay, well, there is some evidence in real life now in certain countries like Israel and other countries that had actually almost reached herd immunity, that those vaccines, the mRNA vaccine, decrease the risk of transmission. It's yet to be proven in the US and other countries, but I think there is some data that tell us, those vaccines can protect from the spread. But what we worry about is those variants and mutants that keep happening. Today I heard about the Indian. In India, there is actually a new variant, and they said it's already here in the US. So that's what you worry about in those. And the coronavirus is well known to have to mutate, and it's natural history for it when it infects several people to start to mutate, to be more virulent and more deadly. So this is why we still need to take precautions. Yes, there is some data about protection from spreading the virus from one person to another in vaccinated people, which is a good thing, but I worry about the variants and the mutations that happen along the way on that virus.
And Naeem mentioned certainly that places like Israel, which are a little bit more captive in the way they've been able to administer the vaccines, we're a long way in the United States from getting to herd immunity. I think on the news tonight I saw that 141 million people in the US have received at least one dose, which is an amazing tour de force of logistics, actually. It can be frustrating and thinking it's been quite long, but this has progressed. I mean, a year ago we were sitting with, hospitals full of patients. So 141 million is good, but it's still less than half the population. So, and you probably need to get to 80-85% of the population either vaccinated or prior infection with protection to reach this herd immunity people talk about. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of progress in the last few months with it, but it's still a long way to go. So I think the main message is just continue the precautions. It's not, none of this is a perfect science by any means either. And, there will be somebody who's been vaccinated at some point that will have a really bad illness. And it will happen just because it's a numbers thing. And we try to be able to predict what we can, but when it comes down to an individual patient, you can't predict everything. So I think maintaining the safeguards and the masking and this bit of social distancing when possible is still a good thing.
Very good point. Thank you for sharing that. I know we are so close. 7:59 is what I'm seeing on my clock, but I do want to ask this question too. Any information or concern for people that are not transplanted, that the vaccines would have any impact on progression of PKD?
No.
I don't think. I think it doesn't really affect PKD progression. It should not actually. So there should not be any link to PKD progression. So PKD patients who have chronic kidney disease or have preserved kidney function, they should get the vaccine. It's highly recommended. Should not really affect their PKD progression.
And I'm assuming then that is the same for those that have a lot of liver involvement as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Correct.
Same.
Okay. Very good. I'm just scanning through here one quick minute. I know we do have some questions that we didn't get to. I think we've covered quite a bit, though, at least touched on most of these. Really good questions. I appreciate everyone out there for submitting their questions. And if you do have more questions, you certainly can send them our way and we'll do our best to answer them. I know that's all the time we have, and I want to thank Dr. Issa and Dr. Dean, both of you, for being here and answering these questions and helping us learn more about the COVID vaccines. I do want to mention that registration is now open for our virtual PKD Connect conference. It is free for the first time. This year's PKD Con will be all virtual and will bring together patients, caregivers, health professionals, and researchers from the safety of your own home. You can go on our website, pkdcure.org, and find all the information and register. The conference will take place on June 25th and 26th. The PKD Foundation does appreciate the opportunity to provide the best possible education. After the webinar, you will receive a survey, and we encourage you to take the survey. It really does help us, and we use the information to plan programs for the future. And make sure that you include any topics that you would like for us to address in future webinars as well. If you need to reach out to us directly, if you have additional questions, you can always reach us at pkdconnect@pkdcure.org. On behalf of everyone at the PKD Foundation, I thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great evening. Thanks so much. We appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.